Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to conservation and careful management of the state's forests to make them more resilient and better habitats for wildlife. ChooseWood.com.
This is St. Louis on the Air from St. Louis Public Radio. I'm Elaine Cha.
Overhead is talent. Overhead is people. Overhead is dreams and vision.
A conscious decision about where you want your dollars to go.
The pledges and the money that actually materialized was very different.
They still aren't quite connected or really understand the needs of that community.
It may not be comfortable to those individuals who are part of the status quo.
Oh, they can just pull themselves up by their bootstraps. Like, what does that mean?
Yeah, right.
So we are a wildly generous community.
There are people who define what's good in a way that's different from how we might define what's good.
No matter the month, nonprofit organizations are focused on mission and money. But August, which is Black Philanthropy Month, holds special significance for nonprofits helmed by Black leaders and dedicated to support from mostly Black community members. And in St. Louis, which enjoys a certain reputation for charitability, including but certainly not limited to the annual Give STL Day, August presents an opportunity to ask folks to consider the what's, where's, and how's for ways to #GiveBlack, regardless of what's in media headlines and at any time of the calendar year. Joining me in studio to talk about that and the realities of raising support for local Black-led, Black-centered nonprofits, we have three St. Louisans with a broad range of experiences. Joining me in studio to talk about that and the realities of raising support for local Black-led, Black-centered nonprofits, we have three St. Louisans with a broad range of experiences. First, we have MK Stallings, founder of UrbArts, a community-based 501c3 with dedicated space in the Old North neighborhood of St. Louis. He's also the research and evaluation manager at the Regional Arts Commission. Welcome, MK.
Thank you.
We've also got Rachel D'Souza, who's founder and principal of Gladiator Consulting. She serves as well as president-elect of the local chapter of the Association of Fundraising Professionals and a sitting member of the Global Council of the Community-Centric Fundraising Movement. Welcome to you.
Glad to be here.
And Shelly Williams, executive director of Access Academies. That is a nonprofit that propels middle school students who've been historically underserved through high school and on to college and career success with enrichment, counseling, and scholarships. And also through the mid-2010s, Shelly was past director of the National Public Media Initiative, American Graduate.
Thank you for having me, Elaine.
So glad to have you all on today. So there was some space there with the intros and then the intro to the show. I'd like to know a little bit about the work and titles I described and how fundraising has been part of your work, both past and present. And MK, let's start with you.
Sure. Again, it's a pleasure to be here on with you. So back in 1999, I founded this organization. It was just Urban Artist Alliance, and we wanted to do, open mics and things of that nature, just making space for artists. So our first introduction into fundraising was through revenue generation, through events, ticketing and such. So for me, it's very much so about, engaging the community, having the community being the ultimate arbiter of what's good about what we do. And they make the decision by supporting us through ticketed purchases at our events over time. And so that's kind of been my history with it. And then beyond that, it's just been about writing grants and asking people, really begging, to kind of support on some level or another, but with various degrees of success.
Okay.
So.
Shelly, how about you?
Sure. So just sort of going back to my work with PBS, right, with 9 PBS, that was funding at both the national and the local level. So a lot of grants that were written, a lot of conversations and meetings, and really trying to better understand at the core of it, what the donor is trying to achieve, right? With the funds that they have to support the community and how we can best partner together. And so sometimes that's answering an RFP and you never get to meet the donor. Other times it's, a lunch and then there's funding, right? So it really does vary how I've been engaged in the funding and the philanthropy process.
So Rachel, Gladiator Consulting, what is it and what was it created to do?
Sure. So I started Gladiator back in 2015. And, really had the hope to bring a slightly non-traditional lens to the idea of organizing money and fundraising for nonprofit organizations. I had fundraised directly for organizations with an international reputation and organizations that were very local in nature, and kept bumping up against these themes that, what donors and funders felt passionate about supporting with their dollars and what community and organizations really needed to thrive weren't lining up. And so wanted to sort of push on those parties to start talking to each other a little bit more, maybe taking some risks in terms of how we think about grant making or how we think about donations, and really get to a point where our institutions here in St. Louis, aren't just scrapping resources together month to month or, budget year over budget year, but could really have the resources they need to create lasting change.
So what you're describing as far as kind of a hand-to-mouth existence is recalling some of what we've talked about, MK. How would you describe what your place has been and with the organizations that you've worked with in the local nonprofit environment or ecosystem?
I would say we're very much so a part of the Black arts movement tradition in terms of being poorly funded and having the funding being subject to approval by bodies that may feel comfortable or uncomfortable about what you present. So oftentimes it makes us have to just do our own thing. And that's the reason why having the community being supporters through ticket buys becomes essential, because otherwise there may not be enough money generated. So no, it's very much so been a grassroots struggle, and it has to be a grassroots struggle just because the powers that be and the monies that be don't necessarily want to support the sort of change that we want to see manifested in the region. And again, it's because of my sociological background, I'd want to kind of go into different spaces with it, but ultimately, there are people who define what's good in a way that's different from how we might define what's good. And that sort of disconnect creates problems in the funding space.
Yeah. So when it comes to art, everyone has their own tastes, and so it's subjective, we could say. Shelly, with the work that you're doing currently around education, it's hard to find someone who would say that education is not something to support. What kinds of challenges are there in, again, sort of this local ecosystem and all of the other organizations that exist somehow to support education?
Sure. So for me, I'm actually in a situation where we were founded by John Vatterott in 2005, and so there's a very large family that supports and lots of friends that support that are associated with that. And so throughout the years, we've been very fortunate to have that consistent, kind of flow, coming to us as far as, people understanding why education is important. So that has not been a challenge for our organization per se.
Yeah.
But at the same time, where we're trying to grow is how do we get beyond our traditional audience, right? That is now aging out, and trying to find and bring in new supporters that also look like our children, because that's another important piece of that is that our kids see that they are being supported by people of color. And that is something that they can recognize as, we do our events as well, that our board, that we've got a diverse board. There's Black leadership since I'm leading, but there also needs to be a diverse board so that there are people that are representing their thoughts, their ideas, their ambitions, and also empowering them.
So we're talking about sort of many different groups of people. And Rachel, you were speaking earlier about getting, different parties to talk to each other. Before we get to that part, though, let's talk about what the fundraising landscape in St. Louis has been, both in the past and the present. So, Rachel, how would you characterize who gives here?
Sure. So one thing I will say about St. Louis is that we are a wildly generous community, both consistently year over year and in moments of crisis or episodic giving. There is also a value placed on who gives and how much they give. And that starts to cause a little bit of, I think, the discrepancies we see. Back in, I think, 2020, the Philanthropic Initiative for Racial Equity released a report called Mismatched. And they essentially looked at giving from 2015 to 18, and then they made some predictions about 2020, but really found a couple things. There is a huge gap between donors and funders who pledge to support Black-led or Black-centered organizations, and in the sort of subcategories of racial justice and racial equity, right? And it's very problematic, honestly, because the pledges and the money that actually materialized was very different.
Okay.
And what I've seen, in the St. Louis region is that we honestly mimic those same national patterns. We have an abundance of incredible organizations that are Black-centered and Black-led. But, for lack of understanding, for lack of relationship, and honestly also for lack of proximity, we don't have a lot of people with access to resources or wealth who are in deep relationship with some of these organizations. And in that absence of relationship and trust, these organizations aren't being funded.
Mm-hmm. This also gets to a point that I want to make sure we clarify, because Black-led is not necessarily the same thing as Black serving. And this has been a point of conversation that I've been part of over the years. What sort of misconceptions or misunderstandings are there around that, MK?
Again, if we use the Black arts movement, because more of an arts background as an example, the reason why it was so important to begin to cultivate and develop a Black aesthetic means that it comes out of these spaces, these cultural spaces where you find certain things to be beautiful. You have certain tastes that are kind of shaped by your experience in America. And if you think about the American experience for African Americans over the centuries, it's been one of domination and repression, the need for resilience and liberation, right? So that means you're going to have certain themes that come out of the art that may not be comfortable to those individuals who are part of the status quo. And so a lot of my experience is centered in that space where you have to be able to honor what you value. Mm-hmm. And it can't be diminished. It can't be marginalized. And so that means that when you have an organization that's Black-led, they have to serve the interest of a broad, non-specific mission. Whereas with us, we have to uplift Black artists where they are and where they want to go.
Yeah. And
that's a very big difference between doing something that is general and nondescript versus something that's very specific and about liberation, about not just resilience, but about joy.
Yeah.
How do you get to a space of joy, where you can just be content with who you are and walk around unencumbered by people's views of you, right? You want to just be free, but how do you get to freedom? And unfortunately, there aren't funding mechanisms that want to ensure that level of Black joy. So that's kind of how I see it. And I think that when you're Black-led, you can't serve that. It's harder to.
Yeah.
Because there are long traditions within certain communities that don't even understand the question,
Yeah.
don't even get why we're talking about this still. In other communities that very much so see this as being a present conversation, just as Rachel mentioned a moment ago, this whole notion about, and I'll wrap my thoughts up with this, this whole notion that there are certain communities that might be disconnected from the experiences of Black-led and Black-centered organizations, or Black artists or Black whomever. Part of that struggle is that they don't necessarily view themselves in relationship, in solidarity, but where that leads us is to a situation where they don't even see the relevance of the conversation. So back in 1960s, St. Louis, they had issues with that. And so it's now surprising that we still see issues with it in 2020 from that report.
We're going to take a very quick break. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio. Now back to our conversation about fundraising and Black-led, Black-serving nonprofits in the St. Louis area. We've been speaking with Shelly Williams, Rachel D'Souza, and MK Stallings. So Shelly, before the break, we were talking about Black-led, Black-serving, not the same thing. And your organization is not Black-serving, sort of in the mission statement, but effectively, most of the students you're working with are Black students. So, I mean, how do you sort of work with or around that, given what philanthropy has been around education in the St. Louis region?
Sure. So I would say my maybe go-to or main strategy there is really educating the donor. Because you can have individuals, and this is, we're in multiple places that I've worked, but you can have individuals that have supported a mission for a very long time. It makes them feel great to be supporting that mission, but they still aren't quite connected or really understand the needs of that community. And, one of the things that I sort of first did when I joined Access Academies, we had our annual celebration dinner that's always in June, and I really wanted to take the opportunity to tell the story from our students' perspective. Mm-hmm. So we ended up sort of producing a little mini documentary, only 20 minutes long, but that little mini documentary versus, just learn about Access, make you feel good about giving, it really was, the intent was to take a deeper dive into the lives of our kids. And we let our kids lead that process. So we gathered them and said, what would you like someone that supports Access to know about you, about your friends, about your community? And what you saw were these beautiful stories about these students that we love our families love us and support us. With the right support and resources, we're able to achieve so many great things. Mm-hmm. You got to see their dreams. They weren't limited in their thoughts. And they really do, appreciate the support that they do receive. But you got to see that from the perspective of, I'm a kid. I'm an everyday kid, and I'm trying to make it. I'm really trying to do my best. So I love to take those, depending on the donor, right? Some donors, you need the stats and the facts and all the information. Others, you really need those personal stories to help move them along the path to help them learn. Because you will get comments like, they can just pull themselves up by their bootstraps. Like, what does that mean?
Yeah, right.
So without really realizing that there's a whole ton of systems that are literally designed to hold them back. So I take it even when I am, whether I'm requesting funding, whether I'm reporting on funding received, whether it's a conversation I have to just talk about young people in St. Louis and how that their growth really does move the region forward, I want you to understand who our kids are. So I see in a lot of ways that I'm representing them in these rooms that they don't have the privilege to be in.
Right.
But I try to carry them with me in every way that I can, and really think about, what would my kids say in this situation? How do they really feel?
Yeah.
And put them in a position where they are empowered, and that they are able to be, as MK was saying, free themselves, that they don't have to shy away or slick their hair back because they're meeting with a donor, So those are all things that are very important when you think about kind of shifting that dynamic, not just from the funding perspective, but how we interact with the people we serve in general.
Right. Now, before the break, Rachel, you had said that St. Louis is wildly generous. That's a quote. Now, in an April 2023 article in the Stanford Social Innovation Review called BIPOC Organizations and the Hamster Wheel of Philanthropy, there's a line there that says Black-led nonprofit organizations have 76% less unrestricted net assets compared to white-led organizations. Rachel, can you unpack that unrestricted net assets part, like as simply and quickly as possible, and maybe provide an example of why unrestricted makes such a difference?
Absolutely. So let's have a little history lesson real quick. The first thing that I'll say is I want us to all sit with the reality that at its root, philanthropy means the love of humankind. That's what it means. And in the United States, and over the course of the last 100 or 50 years, we have come to think of philanthropy as money, and money from wealthy people or money from wildly wealthy people. I think when I ask this question, who is a philanthropist, most people in the room who support nonprofits or who are generous with their resources wouldn't call themselves a philanthropist. They think of Mackenzie Scott, or they think of the Gates, right? They think of these ultra wealthy folks. It is really a lot of those wealthy folks who have driven the policies that our nonprofit communities and foundations function under. And I want to say very clearly that when we think about the systems that we're in, when we think about the policies that govern this sector, they weren't created for nonprofits to solve problems. They weren't created for us to be successful. They were created to provide a benefit to people who gave to a nonprofit organization. So let's just leave that for a second. When we talk about unrestricted resources for an organization, it means that a donor or whomever is giving says, hey, organization, you get to decide what to do with the resources that I am sharing with you. Oftentimes in this space, whether it's institutional philanthropy or individual, gifts can come with strings attached. We will fund a program. We will fund evaluation. We will fund a component of things. And that leaves organizations and causes scratching their heads, first trying to figure out, well, how do I get the rest of the resources I need to execute this program? But also, how do we operate? We oftentimes hear that folks don't want to fund overhead. Overhead is talent. Overhead is people. Overhead is dreams and vision. So if our philanthropy community can't get behind that baseline support, our organizations are never going to be able to meet their mission or their vision.
And that is something, MK, you and I had talked about in our sort of pre-interview, that there are other ways that organizations will partner, but it's partner with quotation marks around it. Yeah. Speak a little bit to that and how it is connected to what Rachel is talking about as far as overhead and operation and paying people.
Yeah. So we're very much so a volunteer organization. We tried to have staff, just couldn't afford it, couldn't do it anymore. And because if all your funds are tied into programs, then that means that all of your staff has to do those programs. Otherwise, they're not going to get paid anything, So what I've experienced in the past, or what we've experienced in the past, is that organizations will partner with us because we look black. We look black on paper, we look black in the community, we just look black. And so, to kind of get that those points for collaboration, particularly collaboration with the Black-led, Black-centered organization, they'll try to partner with us. But that's not really partnership. What they really want to do is contract with us, but they need to elevate us to like a peer status in order for it to seem convincing. And so that sort of tokenism is very much so something that we've experienced. And I don't imagine that's very different from a lot of Black-centered organizations out there if they play the game. And by the game, I mean be subject to these white supremacist notions of what a Black person should do for their community.
Mm-hmm. Now, Shelly, you had talked about some funding that helped with a very specific part of development. Can you talk about how that kind of grant funding is something that helps the sustainability of an organization, not just like yours, but others?
Sure. So when I first joined Access, it just so happened that St. Louis Community Foundation put out a request for proposals or introduced a new grant to support capacity building for Black-led organizations. And so you could really sort of define that as you wanted to and submit your grant and hopefully, cross your fingers, hope that you got it. And we were very fortunate to receive that support. And what was really important about that was for me to think strategically about how to best use that funding, not in the moment and in the time. We are a very small staff, but how do I make sure that that money would then kind of seed knowledge, professional development, opportunities that then would grow legs? And so part of that funding actually, I had to apply for this program, but I was able to get into Focus St. Louis, Leadership St. Louis. That then allowed me to create a brand new bracket of friends and partners, people that are sort of mission aligned with elevating St. Louis. And those connections are now, the fruits of that labor, right? Like I'm starting to see that there are people that want to connect to Access Academies differently than they have in the past, or didn't even know about our organization. So just really thinking about, okay, I'm giving myself this full year with Focus St. Louis to really obtain this information, this knowledge. I'm taking these Fridays every month to participate in this really great programming and learning more about my city. But I'm also creating and building this new network. And as I said earlier, that's part of one of our goals strategically is how do we get beyond the donors that we traditionally have had at Access. So not only do you have staff that are, doing the work, but do they really understand the larger systemic issues? So how do I use that funding to give them the deeper dive so that they really understand the kids that they're working with and if they're, supporting our development work, et cetera, like they see their role and they understand the bigger picture and the larger systems at play and not that they just show up every day to do a job.
Yeah.
So there have been a lot of ways that we've used that funding, but it's been great to have that unrestricted opportunity to really kind of dream and have that vision, as Rachel was saying, and then get that funding, obtain it, and then really leverage it.
So, Rachel, you had said earlier, philanthropy, etymologically, it's love of mankind. It shouldn't be a characteristic that is restricted to people with lots of money. So in the spirit of education for everyone, in these last minutes, I'd like each of you to give us maybe one, tops two, very simple, like quick takeaways that can help folks who want to hashtag give black and just give black whether there's a hashtag or not, to give better when it comes to closing support gaps for nonprofits here in St. Louis. Let's start with you, MK.
I think the key is educating yourself about what the philanthropic nonprofit landscape looks like and making a conscious decision about where you want your dollars to go to kind of uplift groups that have historically not received an equitable share of what's out there. And to that end, there are opportunities such as stuff that I'm going to present later on in the fall, where we'll talk about the philanthropic and the organizational landscape of nonprofit organizations. And, hopefully people will attend that. That way we can kind of talk more about and look at what the pie looks like. So.
We'll include that in our web post. Rachel?
Sure. So as you mentioned, August is Black Philanthropy Month, and we have coming up on August 28th, Give Black Day. I think one easy thing folks can do is hop on the St. Louis Community Foundation's website and get connected with those organizations and give to an organization you don't know a lot about. Be proactive in building that relationship. And I gotta put some responsibility on the shoulders of my nonprofit friends. We have to get a little bit braver about having difficult conversations with our donors. So opening that door.
Okay. And Shelly, last minute.
I'm going to go very similar with MK and say education is definitely key. And not just kind of who, where, why you give, your passion that you have, but also really understanding, right? So if you're giving money, are you voting the same way, right? Like, are you voting against kind of in a way like organizations that you're supporting with your dollar? So really thinking and taking that deeper dive, have conversations with the people that you're serving will really go a long way.
Shelly Williams is Executive Director of Access Academies and past Director of the National Public Media Initiative American Graduate. Rachel D'Souza is founder and principal of Gladiator Consulting and president-elect of the local chapter of the Association of Fundraising Professionals and a sitting member of the Global Council of the Community-Centric Fundraising Movement. And MK Stallings is the founder of UrbArts, based in the Old North neighborhood, and Research and Evaluation Manager with the Regional Arts Commission. Thank you all so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
This episode was produced by Elaine Shaw.
Our audio engineer is Aaron Dorr. This podcast was mixed and edited by Aaron.
Our executive producer is Alex Hoyer.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
St. Louis on the Air proudly supports local artists by using music from Life Creative Group.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations. And leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thanks.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association. Missouri produces wood pallets, railroad ties, white oak barrels, hardwood floors, and more. Details on the variety of products made in the state are at choosewood.com.